Hello, welcome to the Deep Collaboration Podcast. In this series, we talk to people who are leading the way in making working together smarter and more productive. With me today, I have Joop van der Voort, founder and CEO of Remote.com, which provides international payroll, benefits, taxes, and compliance for businesses big and small. Welcome to the show, Joop.
Thanks for having me, Don.
Did I get your name right?
Joop. Yeah,
Joop.
It's good enough.
I live in Amsterdam now myself, so I'm practicing
Oh, you do? Oh, we're really
Dutch.
close. Yeah. Oh, they're really close. We're like 20 kilometers apart.
Okay, where are you based?
Yeah, Assendelft, which is, 3 train stops from there.
Excellent. So why don't you tell us a little more about Remote.com? What are the challenges that you see remote teams most struggling with, and how does your business help them?
It might be interesting if I tell you the founding story. So before Remote, I was at GitLab since its founding, and we built one of the largest distributed teams in the world. Never had any offices. And what we found was the one real struggle in all of that was not working together. It was not languages. It was the thing that we solved with Remote. Every time we would hire someone new in a country where we never hired someone before, we would have to figure out how do we take care of payroll and benefits and how do we stay compliant? And we found that there's really no good solution to that. The official way to solve this is to set up an entity locally and do all of this yourself, but it becomes very unwieldy very quickly. We had people in 67 different countries. So, imagine setting up all those entities. I now know that is an incredible amount of work. So I thought, more organizations are going to work this way in the future, distributed, remotely, etc., because the benefits are immense for everybody involved. So I should solve the biggest struggle that we have with that and we truly allow this and ultimately, bring opportunities to people anywhere so that you can truly work from anywhere. And so I started Remote exactly to do that. And then the whole idea was to solve that whole piece. You should be able to come to us. And today you can tell us, I want to hire Jane. She lives in Portugal. I have no idea how to pay someone in Portugal and how to do all of that. And so that is exactly what my company Remote solves.
Yeah, that's quite the problem. I lived in Paris for a while, and looking to be employed by an American company was quite a challenge precisely because they didn't have a foreign entity in France that I could be an employee of. So I'm actually very curious to know, because I know how this problem got solved somewhat in France, but what does the structure of this look like as a remote employee? How do you structure this to make it work?
Yeah. So Remote, the company, owns entities in all countries in the world. At least that is our goal. We're not there yet. We're now in about 50. We're getting there. In those countries, we act as a local employer, like a proper local employer. And so if you live in France and your American employer wants to hire you through us, what we do is that Remote France hires you. So you have a contract with Remote France. On your tax forms, it says Remote France. And in all other ways, your employer just treats you like any other employee. The only thing we do is we essentially act, and like the way you see us is sometimes exchanging messages with us, and you receive your pay slips and this kind of stuff on our platform, and you enter your bank account information there. So for you, we're mostly just an HR piece of software, but in terms of legal infrastructure, we are actually your liable employer locally, and we have to make sure you are compliant, we are compliant, as well as your actual employer, your American employer. And then what we do internally is that we take care of everything we need to do, which is very different on a country by country basis. And then we just invoice your employer every single month the total amount of your salary and any other costs that an employer might have to employ someone in France. They pay that, and we use that to pay out your salary.
I see. No, that makes perfect sense. It's kind of a shame that it has to be set up like this, right? Like, I feel like the COVID pandemic has really showed us where the seams are in the global employment system. Yeah. And so it's great to see companies like Remote step in and fill these sort of administrative glue roles that suddenly we didn't really realize that we needed before. What have been the biggest challenges for you in setting up this sort of system? Like, is there some country, for example, that's been particularly difficult to navigate the bureaucracy? Or
it is incredibly difficult to do this. We expected it to be very difficult, and I think it's like fourfold more difficult than we anticipated. The first challenge you encounter is the fact that this kind of model, the model of an employer of record, which is what this is called, it is not a recognized model everywhere. So in many countries, you have to find a way to operate as is, right? That is achievable, but it also means that you have to start, you have to basically dig in locally. You have to say, we're going to open in this country. Now we have to spend time figuring out how anybody builds any kind of business here. How can we operate as a business, as an employer of record? How can we pay out people, and how can we make sure that we avoid the problems that you would otherwise have, right? The things like related to permanent establishment and misclassification and anything else that comes with that. And every country is completely different in that sense. And so for every country, we basically have to start from zero and start figuring all of this out. Then once we're set up, there's quite a lot of work involved to just run payroll, to provide benefits. Statutory benefits are different in every country in the world. And so we have to figure out how to take care of those. And in some countries, it might be healthcare. In other countries, it might be a pension. But either way, we must figure that out before we can employ a single person. So we do this for all countries in the world. The interesting thing is that you can't just, well, I mean, in theory you could, but it's a really bad idea. You can't just open 1 million subsidiaries. You know, you have a single topco and then you have 1 million subsidiaries below that. You have to spend a lot of time thinking about, how do I pay tax? Because in every country in the world, that country wants you to treat the entity that you have there as an independent company, right? You have to file taxes for it. You have to report what kind of business you are doing. You have to be able to provide a balance sheet. And so what you can't do is you can't, in all these countries, completely individually run your business, and you have to somehow bring it up to your topco. And that in of itself is a massive challenge. And, paying taxes in 50 plus countries at the same time, at different cadences with different rules, incredibly challenging.
What is it like harmonizing vacation schedules, right? Because this is one of those administrative areas that touches on not just you and the employee, but the employer as well. And I know, here in Europe, for those of you listening who don't know, like typically employees will just take all of August off, and Europe completely changes its character. It's a fascinating place to be in August, right? But in the US, like maybe you get 2 weeks of holiday, and you're probably not going to take them in August. You're probably going to take them much earlier in the summer if you take them at all, or over the winter holidays.
So there's different sides to it. For us as an employer of record, we have to make sure everybody's compliant, right? So there's a statutory minimum of days off someone has to take. And it's our job to make sure that the person actually takes those days, or if possible, gets compensated for them if they wouldn't take them. Beyond that, our role isn't necessarily to say, this is how you should do it with all your employees, even the ones that are not employed through us. Of course, we run a remote organization. We have our internal employees in more than 40 different countries. And the way we treat it is we essentially say, you can take time off whenever you want, wherever you want. Just make sure your colleagues know this, because you can't really count on exactly that. You don't want to harmonize that. You don't want to try to find a pattern in that. The only really thing that you want to try is to make sure that in teams where it is necessary for one or multiple people to be available at all time, that those people synchronize with each other and create a schedule of some sort. But beyond that, the best solution is to just not look for a solution. There's nothing to do. It's okay if a part of the team is part of the year out. And in terms of what do you want to offer? I think the easiest way to solve this is, if you're willing to do this as an employer, of course, and this is what we do, is to say we have unlimited vacation days with a minimum amount that you take up. So unlimited is great, but it tends to be used as it's unlimited. And then people are looked down upon if you actually take a lot of time. So what we do is we have a minimum amount of days that you have to take each year. If you don't do it, we're going to force you to take vacation off. And it is not a joke, because you have to take care of yourself. And that is high. That's a high number, and it's high enough so that it's above statutory in most, if not all, countries.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a really good system. I've worked for companies that had unlimited vacation policies, and nobody really took the time off, because it was, you can just take it off next week when we're not so busy, except of course, you're busy next week too.
Yeah, no, I think a minimum is a really good solution to this problem, because you don't have the guilt that comes with taking time off, with unlimited time off, because it's not really unlimited. You can't not work for the whole year, right? That is established between everybody.
So you must be in a very unique position to observe trends in remote working. And I'm curious, are there any interesting trends that you've observed in hot spots where people are working from, or places where, or fields where there's unexpected levels of interest in remote working?
I think the interesting thing is that it's universal. That the thesis we had a long time ago about remote work, and with we, I mean the remote working community, that this is better, most people will prefer it, and most people will enjoy the benefits of it. That tends to be mostly true, and it tends to be mostly true for most people, especially those that pre-pandemic didn't imagine themselves working remotely. I think today, it is now June 3rd. I think we're seeing a lot of people now, a lot of employers saying we're going to go back to the office. And we're hearing a lot of people saying, well, if I have to go back to the office, I'm going to look for a different job, because working remotely in a pandemic is not great, right? Like, it's the worst way to work remotely. But if you realize that, out of the pandemic, it gives you incredible flexibility. It it gives you so many hours back in the day where you have so few already. It's an obvious benefit. And that, I think, is the most interesting thing. And that is a universal thing. The kind of companies we speak to is across the board. Almost every kind of company. There's very few. There's, of course, many professions that are not possible to do yet remotely, and that is unfortunate. But for those that are, almost all of them have a very large group of people that say, well, I will only want to work remotely. And if I'm not able to do so, and if I don't have flexible work, then that is not interesting work for me anymore. That is absolutely the most interesting trend we are seeing.
Yeah, there's a study that came out today here in the Netherlands. I don't know if you saw, from Acties.nl, that said 25% of people surveyed would rather change jobs than go back to the office, which I found to be, actually, I found that to be surprisingly low. I'd have thought maybe it was higher, but I know that changing jobs in Europe is a much, much bigger deal than it is, for example, in the United States in many cases. So I think that's a pretty significant vote in favor of continued remote work and the benefits of it. And I can drop maybe a link to that in the links below. So the big question for a lot of remote workers is time zones. I myself have worked in a team that spanned the globe in terms of time zones. We found it a bit of a challenge to manage a team like that. Like, what recommendations do you have for managers of teams that are facing the possibility of having people, well, in different time zones? And would you recommend against like having a truly global team across all time zones? Or do you recommend trying to form teams in clusters?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think time zones are one of the few things you can solve for with remote work, with asynchronous work. You can work asynchronously really, really well, but it's good to have overlap in working schedules. And that means that it's very difficult to build a team that is extremely spread out in terms of time zones. And with extremely spread out, I mean that if you have an overlap of 4 hours, that's sufficient. And 4 hours are easy to get, right? That is, we are both in the Netherlands. We can have 4 hours of overlap with someone on the East Coast in the US. That is doable for us. But someone on the West Coast of the US, that is going to be much harder to do. Much harder to get to those 4 hours. We're going to get maybe 2 hours if we stretch it. In my case, I actually make long days and I tend to work at nights because I have many meetings with people on the West Coast. And in my mornings, I often meet with people, in New Zealand and Australia, because we have several people there as well. And so if you're building a team, and this is thinking about a small team, right? Like not an organization, you will want to avoid having an extremely spread out team, with the exception of people that are extremely aware of the challenges that come with that and are very experienced in working asynchronously and are happy to do that, knowing that they might feel isolated or they might feel like it's hard to quickly get things done, right? So it is generally really hard. And if you're building a team and you have the option to not do that, I would always recommend keep a sliding window, right? So the window is maybe plus minus 4 hours from wherever the weight of the team is. And then you can increase it depending on how much more you hire to the edges of that window, so that there's some overlap always between particular members. But if you think about like a team that has a particular objective, that tends to be no longer, the two pizza kind of team. Yeah, you don't really want that team to be very spread out. Or worst of all, what you don't want to do is if that team has a strong center somewhere and then there's a few outliers, many hours away, because they will feel isolated. In all cases, it is a challenge. And at the same time, I would encourage any kind of business, especially growing businesses, especially businesses from, 100 plus employees, to try to build a truly distributed team where you literally hire from everywhere. But you have to be very intentional about where you hire people and how those people engage. And I have an example. At Remote, we hired, my colleague James, who's in Australia. And when we hired him, he was the furthest away and the first person in Australia, where we have a really heavy weight of employees around Europe, around the Americas. So all very doable in terms of time zone. And now he was all the way there in Australia. And the only reason that we were comfortable with doing that was because he's very experienced in working remotely. He's very experienced in his job, in his function, and he's very experienced in, working asynchronously. And he was aware of the challenges that came with that. But nonetheless, even with him, he sometimes feels like he's out of the loop, even for an organization like ours that is very diligent about working asynchronously, because you're working when everybody else is asleep and vice versa. And we don't have an office, but you don't get the online chatter either. The updates that come in through your project management or through Slack or anything else. So it is very difficult to do so. I wouldn't necessarily say to avoid it, but I would say it's very, very difficult. And working asynchronously and recording meetings and taking diligent notes is an absolute must.
You mentioned that this employee was experienced with remote work. Like what sorts of skills and tools do you expect a remote worker to have, and that maybe those who are thinking about working remotely should be working on while they have the opportunity?
Yeah, most importantly, they should be able to communicate by writing extremely well. Right? The written communication needs to be really, really strong, and their ability to work independently, take decisions independently, and unblock themselves or, easily transition between tasks. Those are all absolutely vital to someone wanting to work remotely really, really well. The better you are at those things, the less you are dependent on having direct synchronization between you and your colleagues, and the less you're dependent on actually being, working at the same time. I think those are the most important things, and those are very broad characteristics someone must have.
Mm-hmm. And what about managers? Like, how can you be a better manager of a remote team, especially if you've only done like synchronous in office sorts of management before?
I think it's not very different, to be honest. I think if you're a great in-person manager, you can be a great remote manager. I just think that there's a lot of terrible managers that think they are managing people not because they are doing a good job of managing, but because they are present and they are looking over the shoulder of people. A great manager is someone that coaches their teams, that helps them get unblocked, and make sure their colleagues and their reports are doing well. And that is exactly the same between the office and between doing that remotely.
Yeah, that's a good answer. So I want to talk just a little bit about tooling. What is your recommended remote working stack? What do you use at remote.com?
I think there's not a single stack that works for everybody, right? For one, especially in growing organizations, you don't want to overwhelm people with tools. And so we don't use too many tools at remote. We use things, our team is now almost 200 in total. So we use things that scale well across that. So we use Slack, we use Zoom, which is really good. You can actually have 200 people in a single video call. And beyond that, we use tools that are specific to the kind of job that we do. So for designing, we use Figma. For engineering, we use GitLab. For project management needs, we use Asana. And that's about it. And then we use the Google suite of tools. But that's about it. I think the only thing that we do that is there's two things that we do a little bit out there. One is Tandem. We use this for audio presence. So Tandem is an audio calling. You can also video call with it, but it's primarily audio. So you have multiple rooms. You can just drop in, similar to Discord. And it works really well for that purpose. It's really nice that if you want to feel like present within your team, if you want to have something very casual, or you just want to be working and able to talk to your colleagues, Tandem is really, really nice for that. The other thing we do, which is really out there, is everybody that works at remote gets sent a VR headset, an Oculus Quest 2. And sometimes we hang out in VR, which is really, really cool to do. We don't really use it for work proper, but we use that for bonding and for fun and spending time together.
How does this work? Like, what is there a particular software package that you use for this?
Yeah, for one, you should buy one because it's really, really incredible. And they're not there. They're like €300 for us. So the moment you put that thing on, there's a whole software suite already running on it, right? There's all sorts of tools to easily connect with your friends. There's all sorts of games already. And then there's a whole number of apps similar to, on your phone or your app on your computer that you can install and you can play with. So we use Rec Room, for example, which is an amazing way to hang out with friends together in a single room. And that's exactly what we use. And sometimes we play games together. If you are live and if you're online in VR, you can see that your friends are as well. And so you can join them in a game. For example, Beat Saber is a very popular game and you can actually play together with colleagues. And so last year around Christmas, we did a Beat Saber tournament, which was really, really cool.
That sounds amazing. I haven't tried Beat Saber multiplayer yet, but I imagine that's quite good.
It's really nice because normally in Beat Saber, for the people that don't know, you hold two lightsabers, there's blocks coming flying at you and you have to slice through them at the beat of the music. the nice thing about doing that in multiplayer is that in the distance, you see your friends doing that as well. You see their blocks flying at them, and you see the little avatars waving around, and you talk to each other at the same time. So you're like, oh my God, this part is so difficult. It's really fun. I really like it.
It sounds like an amazing bonding opportunity for remote people. Yeah, that really hadn't occurred to me. I've seen people do, offsites where they would gather in one place in person, but I don't think I've really ever heard of anybody exploring VR as an alternative for bringing people together. And I guess you could do it on relatively short notice even, right? Just something impromptu and ad hoc.
If you have one of these lying around, you and I could, be in a VR room within a minute or two, without ever doing that before with each other. And if we are both all set up, as in we connected as friends, it's 2 seconds. You put the thing on, it's on, you join the room, that's it. It's really fast.
Very cool. Is there anything else that you think you'd like to share now that we've talked about a number of topics? While I'm thinking of maybe one last question to round this all.
I mean, nothing in particular. I think remote work has incredible advantages. And I think, to me, one of the most amazing ones is that it gives people, independent of their location, access to opportunities, and through opportunities, the ability to build wealth and build a better life for themselves without having to move to a place where they don't really want to live. And one example of that, for example, is that everybody wants to build a diverse organization. But the reality is that most startups in particular, and tech startups in particular, are not particularly diverse, right? And people have to, specifically look to build a diverse team. And what you get is you get all sorts of policies around that. And what that results in is still not a good reflection of society. When we built Remote, we set out to build a very diverse team. But our attitude was, well, if we hire from anywhere, and we make sure that we build a company that is inclusive, where we are aware of biases that we might have in hiring, then rather than just trying to meet particular criteria, through just doing that, we should be able to build a diverse organization. And that's exactly what we are seeing. And I think that is one of the most exciting things because, as I said, I live in Aston-Delft, which is, there's nothing here. There's a bunch of schools here and a bunch of houses, but other than that, there's nothing here. And I come from close from here as well. I should have access to those opportunities, but even more so people that live somewhere in the world where you don't have as much access to technology as I have here, or even access to money to be able to travel as I have here. And that is exactly what we're seeing with Remote. The kind of people that we employ are literally from all over the world. And that is an amazing thing to see. And that makes me very excited.
Yeah, I think that's probably the most powerful argument for building a fully remote team right there, because a diverse team is always going to be a stronger team in the end. Yep. Thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate having you here on the show with us and sharing your insights with us. You're listening to the Deep Collaboration Podcast with Joop van der Voort from remote.com, and we'll see you again later.